Launch of Global Obligations for the Right to Food, which is a product of a task force of the Working Group on Nutrition, Ethics and Human Rights. This task force was established 3 years ago to work on a product, which is the book that we're launching this morning, to look at the global obligations for the right to food as opposed to the national obligations and beyond the national obligations for people within their own countries. It is my pleasure to open this as chair of the Working Group on Nutrition, Ethics and Human Rights. But I would like George Kent to introduce this project that he has been leading as task force convener and editor of the book.
It's important to understand that this book is part of a series, really, that's come out of people involved with the Working Group on Nutrition, Ethics and Human Rights over the years. I did a book on freedom from want, the human right to adequate food, that was published in 2005, and in a way is the precursor to this one. Then there were 2 volumes on food, human rights and development, I forget the exact title, edited by Wenke Bard-Eide and Uwe Kraft, with contributions from several of the participants in the Working Group on Nutrition and Human Rights. So this, in that view, is the 4th. So overall, the Working Group on Nutrition, Ethics and Human Rights has been, I would say, quite productive. Not only in these books, but in other quarters as well. We're taking up the issue of nutrition, ethics, and human rights in many forms, and I think in a very constructive way. The key point of the book is this. The earlier book I did on freedom from want, human right to adequate food, focused, like most human rights literature does, focuses on the obligations of national governments to their own people. That's really what most of modern human rights is about. But the concluding chapter there said, well, there is also the issue of what's commonly called external obligations, or sometimes called international or global obligations as well. All of us in this work agree that primary responsibility belongs with national governments, with the state, and should be inward-looking. But we insist that's not the only responsibility. There are external responsibilities as well. There has actually been a great deal of work been done on this in relation to food and other issues over the last few years. There's at least a half a dozen books on global responsibility, global obligations relating to human rights. Not all focused on food, but there's a lot of people looking at that. Much of that literature goes under the label of ETOs, extraterritorial obligations, and much of that literature focuses on the obligations of individual states. For example, if a state exports a food product that is contaminated and hurts people in another country, then it's very clear who is the responsible party and who has the obligations there. But here in this work, the focus is different. We are talking about obligations that are not clearly assigned to a particular state, but rather are obligations of all of us taken together somehow, global obligations. And I very carefully avoid the term international. We're going beyond the presumption that the responsibility lodges in or originates with or rests with nations. As in my perspective, nations are a convenient administrative construct that we've had around, common dating. It goes to the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. But we can have a different kind of organizational structure tomorrow. The unchanging thing is the deep moral responsibility of all people. When I say that we're talking about the responsibility of all of us, I mean all of us as people. We maybe express it through states at the moment, but that's not necessarily so. There are a number of issues on which idea of external responsibility should be very clear. When, for example, world food prices rise as they do now, where does the responsibility lodge? When we have climate change altering or damaging people's capacity to provide for their own livelihoods, where does the responsibility lie? Who is to act? If we have a market system that systematically widens gaps between rich and poor, there's not a particular bad guy to be chased down. It's a systemic thing. Therefore, there must also be systemic responsibility. That is responsibility for the group as a whole. Yesterday, in the group on capacity building, there's discussion about the brain drain of nutritionists. Where does the responsibility lie? There needs to be a locus of responsibility that is somehow at the global level, but I insist that the concept of the global level and there being responsibility lodged there is no more amorphous than the concept of the state, which is a vague concept. We create governments to represent states. We need to create comparable administrative units to carry out the functions and the responsibilities of the world as a whole. There's work to be done on that. But the core of the book is about the premise that there are global responsibilities. We need to do some work to figure out what those are. The work is not finished by the book by any means. The intention is only to open. The core point is that for our work on nutrition is that when a child is malnourished, that child may have the misfortune of being born in a poor country, but that child is not born into a poor world. And we need to keep attention on that very simple fact. The moral premise here is that this is not their problem, it's our problem. At the reception the night before last, I talked to a U.S. government official and said, we have to begin thinking of that child not as their child, but as our child. And he looks at me and says, that's going to be a hard sell. Yes, but it's the right thing to do. And that's what we're about in doing this human rights-oriented work. I think it's very important to appreciate that in the current approaches to dealing with child nutrition and related issues, there's systematic designed-in neglect of the most marginalized people. If you look, for example, at the Achui Reach project, they are cherry-picking the most capable of the weak nations and are going to work with them. And they don't speak about the weaker nations that don't meet their standards for engagement in their project. And so the most marginalized people are further marginalized once again. It's systematically designed into the project. Similarly, the Millennium Development Project, which presents the illusion of being a global project, but if you can find the global project with a global resource base, with a global management body, with a global plan, I'd like you to help me find it. I haven't yet found it. The Millennium Development Project is an illusion with regard to the idea of global action, global commitment, global responsibility. Yes, I know we already have international assistance on some level, and in some quarters it looks generous, but if you look at it overall, it's not generous. The developed countries made a commitment more than 30 years ago to raise their development assistance to 0.7% of their gross national products. They have yet to reach half of what they committed. I think someone needs to call the world to account, and that's what we're doing here, calling the entire world to account. So we're asking here, as I said, we've offered a number of suggestive analyses here. We'll hear about them in a moment. We're now asking for more systematic work on this issue of global obligations, based on the fundamental appreciation that there is such a thing. if you don't get that, you can't get started on the discussion. So we want to discuss this in terms of a variety of concrete issues. Ultimately, what we're talking about is reconfiguring human rights so it is global and literally international. We have to get away from the idea that rights and obligations somehow stop at borders. There's no logic to rights and obligations stopping at national borders. But even deeper than that, what we're really talking about, redesigning global governance. And for people with the interests we have here in the problems of nutrition in all their forms, it would be very interesting to take on the challenge of what should the global food system look like. We know a lot about what's wrong with it, but we don't know how to fix it, and maybe we need to put that on the agenda and think about how it ought to be reconfigured. We have to have the vision, or we surely can never have it. You can't have a chair if you can't envision it. So I want to then, on the basis of that premise, that introduction, ask various contributors to describe their orientation to this work and their particular chapters, and then we'll go on and solve the problems from there. Margaret, would you start?
Along with Federica Donati at the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights, I wrote a chapter on the legal dimension of the legal aspects of the international dimension for the right to food, which of course was trying to be sober and correct, yet forward-looking. We spent a lot of time to try to distinguish between the law as it is today and the law as it should be, with making some recommendations about where we think things are going and where we think they should be going. I'd like to break down a little bit about the various aspects of the international dimensions for the right to food. The first is the obligation of one state to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to food in another country. Does not exist. We found that there is, at the very least, an obligation to respect that right. That can find its expressions in many ways, such as, for instance, when it comes to export of agricultural produce and issues of dumping in international trade. Secondly, the obligation to protect. We find that it is nascent. It is about to become international law, but we are not convinced that it really is there at the moment. And that applies to regulating companies such as transnational corporations for operations in other countries. Of course, the primary examples, and that is treated in the book, is the baby milk substitute marketing system, and how that international responsibility needs to be strengthened. Secondly, as to the obligation to fulfill, we quoted the General Comment 12 that says that states that are in a position to do so should assist other states. But it's really difficult to find a legal basis for, in a particular situation, a particular other state has a particular obligation. It is just too fuzzy at the international law as it stands today. We do not have a system of really clearly allocating those responsibilities. We cannot say there's a crisis in Somalia, therefore France must give so and so much assistance. We don't have that. We have a much fuzzier environment. The second dimension of this international obligation is that states are members of international organizations. As such, they have responsibilities and obligations. They have human rights obligations that they take with them when they operate within international organizations, from UNICEF and FAO to the World Bank and the IMF and WTO. these obligations are still there. What is missing is accountability mechanisms. It is very hard still to hold states accountable for what they are doing as members of governing bodies of the UN system. But it is increasing, and Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is starting to ask questions of those states, what they are doing. The question of whether transnational corporations themselves have human rights obligations, we found not to be so. We found that they have responsibilities, but they do not amount to obligations at the international level. They do have obligations under national laws to obey the laws of the land. That means that states have obligations and must act on those obligations to have regulations that force transnational corporations wherever they operate to abide by certain rules and standards to protect human rights. And the final questions that we looked into is whether organizations like FAO have themselves human rights obligations. That was a very, very difficult question we found. We can say that on one hand, organizations that have mandates related to the right to food, like FAO does, they have obligations to fulfill that mandate. But does that mean that they actually have human rights obligations? We were not convinced. We were not sure. But they need to be stronger, they need to be more operational, and there's much work still to be done to really make it happen, not just in terms of clarification, but actually setting standards. And that is where, within our current system of international law, states have to take action. States have to say, we recognize those dimensions, and we decide to regulate them in such and such and such a way, and that must be our long-term goal for those rules to be established. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, George, for spearheading this whole set of events that led up to this book, and also to co-authors, many of whom are not here. My chapter in this book, to some might look very out of place in a book that's Global Obligation to the Right to Food, because I talk about controlling 3 infections, which are obviously going to help nutritional status, that I think can improve nutritional status. So my chapter, which is entitled Global Action Against Worm Infections, Measles and Malaria, may look a little out of place. My colleagues think that it's not out of place. Because I believe in countries of the South, especially if they want to move quickly to reach the Millennium Development Goals of reducing hunger, by which they mean really undernutrition, by the year 2015, they're much more likely to reach those goals if they controlled these 3 infections, because I think that's doable, than with a food-related program. I'm not against the food-related program, but I think these 3 infections are most important. This George may not know that the other George W. Bush, somehow seems to have got hold of a copy of this book just before he went to Africa. Because in northern Tanzania, he went to a hospital in Arusha, and he more or less declared, as he gave a child a bed net, that he was going to make sure all Tanzanian children at risk of malaria had bed nets, that they had a right to have bed nets. He moved to Liberia 3 days later, and I think for the first time a U.S. president mentioned the word hookworm. He stated, we're neglecting important tropical diseases such as hookworm, and we have an obligation to do something about them. So George W. has taken over from our George to do something. Let me just read you something to verify what I'm saying from the BBC. President George W. Bush has said the U.S. will help provide 5.2 million mosquito nets as part of a broader campaign to tackle malaria. He said it will provide free nets for every Tanzanian child aged 1 to 5. He stated it is unacceptable to people here in Africa who see their families devastated and their economies crippled. is unacceptable also to the people of the United States, who believe every human life has value, and so on. So he has swallowed all of this. Let me just go, and I'm not going to read from the book, but in writing this chapter, I mean, I choose these three infections, worm infections, measles, and malaria, because I think we can do something about them quickly. Clearly, respiratory infections and diarrheal disease are more common causes of morbidity and mortality. But each of those are caused by 20, 30 different organisms, toxins, etc., etc. Other than some vaccines, such as, again, rotavirus for diarrhea, that are too expensive and only being used in the north, we don't have good ways of moving quickly through it, whereas these three infections, I think we can do something about. We heard quite a lot the other day from our friend dealing with the Lancet, Bob Black, about dahlias, about the losses due to certain diseases. I'm trying to find the part here where we deal with this in relation to these. Getting to worms and malaria, the World Bank, using disability-adjusted life years, loss per annum, estimated a whopping 39 million for intestinal worms, a little greater than the 35.7 for malaria, 4 times as much as for vitamin A, which everybody is excited about dealing with, and 5 times more than for diabetes. Yet we don't hear very much about deworming children. So the World Bank said gets more dahlias for deworming than for vitamin A, and much more than for many other conditions. Why did I choose these three? I've stated that I chose them because I think we can do something about them. So I'm not going to educate you about worms, but we have very simple, safe anthelmintics given once a year, or in some areas once every 6 months, will greatly reduce parasitic infections. Parasitic infections affect growth, many other aspects of life, and do have an impact on mortality, obviously hopefully on anemia. Measles, to me, disgraceful that we still have such high mortality rates from measles when we have a very good vaccine, and in theory measles could be eliminated from the world. The other thing that's surprising about this is that in the northern countries, be it in the United States or the UK or Norway, we have to go on immunizing our children against measles because we don't get rid of measles in the rest of the world. In doing this paper, I looked at smallpox, the eradication of smallpox, which strangely enough was actually started more by the Russians than the Americans. The Russians actually got more money in the United States. But after we got rid of smallpox from the world, within 1 year, I think in 9 months, the, $900 million the U.S. put into it. The U.S. saved by not having to vaccinate its own population and have surveillance. Shouldn't we be doing this the same? And we are trying to do a little bit about polio, but not against measles. Malaria, in most of the African countries where I work, we're not going to get rid of in the next 10 or 20 years. But we can make a major impact with bed nets and by good treatment available close by, not using chloroquine, using new drugs. We could make a huge dent and has a big impact on nutrition. How does this fit into all of this? I mean, I do think that a Tanzanian family or a Senegalese family should try and use their own money to buy a bed net. They often can't afford it. I do think the Tanzanian government and the Senegalese government have an obligation to provide all of their children and adults and mothers with bed nets. They say that it'll take up more than half the budget of the Ministry of Health, so they're not going to do it. So then I think, as my other co-authored stated, I think we have global obligations to fulfill the children being dewormed, being immunized against measles, having this attention to malaria. How could all of this be done? In all cases we talked about how do you achieve these things we think are highly desirable. And I do think it would be feasible if enough countries got together and went to the General Assembly, the World Health Assembly, which is the governing board of WHO, as they did with smallpox, and put forward resolutions saying in the next 5, 10 years, we're going to do all these three things. And then called upon the World Bank and Gates and everybody to provide the money to help reach these important obligations. So that's the theme of the chapter that I wrote. And I think, in fact, it does therefore fit in with it, because as a physician, but also as a nutritionist, I do think we talk or try and rely, or the literature tends to rely too much only on food, not dealing enough with care and with health as means of improving nutritional status. And I think we can probably get more for our buck more quickly if we gave more attention to the health aspects of nutrition. Thank you.
My chapter, which I wrote in collaboration with Anita Ramana, who is at the University of Pune in India, looks at a different aspect, namely seeds. Now, I think it's fairly obvious what seeds have to do with the right to food. Where does the food come from? Well, it comes from seeds. Whether we're talking about plant foods or animal foods, seeds are obviously very important. But we look at how they're important not only to producing food to be consumed, but also important to farmers' livelihoods. And poverty and hunger globally are still overwhelmingly rural phenomena. So livelihoods in rural areas are tied to seeds. I come from the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research System. We do plant breeding. We need access to seeds also to continue agricultural innovation that will be beneficial not only in terms of nutrition, but boosting farmers' incomes and making food affordable to consumers. And finally, seeds are very important in terms of humanitarian response, restoring agricultural livelihoods, restoring development in rural areas. Often seed systems are destroyed in emergencies, whether it's a natural disaster, a war, or a combination of the two. So seeds are important on a very multiple number of levels. Now, this is also spoken to, I think, in not only the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Agriculture is mentioned in relation to the right to food, but the right to food guidelines elaborate on this in some detail. The importance of access to resources, plant genetic resources are mentioned quite explicitly in the guidelines. What we find is the global governance of seeds is a multiple set of sometimes conflicting institutions and agreements. Traditionally, one had open access to seeds. Farmers, breeders, seed companies, whoever wanted plant genetic resources, they were freely available. It was, one speaks of the commons and the enclosure of the commons. Well, we had genetic commons. Now, what we've seen is an increasing movement towards enclosure of those commons. First of all, if one looks at the Convention on Biological Diversity, there was a lot of sentiment in developing countries that this open access system resulted in something called biopiracy. In fact, open access meant open poaching. So the Convention on Biological Diversity really creates a system of sovereign national rights over genetic resources. And that means those rights are vested in governments. Governments may or may not share the benefits with farmers, with rural poor people. We also have, 2 years later, the World Trade Organization agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, which says that all WTO members must create a system of intellectual property rights over plant varieties. This does not have to be patents. There are a variety of systems possible, but again, this is enclosing the genetic commons. And then finally, there is a new international agreement called the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, which does speak to farmers' rights, that is the right of farmers to save, reuse, and exchange seeds. And it also speaks to creating a multilateral system of plant genetic resources, germplasm, that would remain in the public domain. So basically what we then do in our chapter is look at how one state, it's a case study of how India has tried to resolve all these competing obligations. They have to have intellectual property rights over seeds. Farmers should have the ability to save seeds. There's already a contradiction there. India has ratified the covenant, so it upholds the right to food, and we've heard about the Supreme Court case in India over the last few days. So how do you balance these things? Well, India has a law on farmers' rights and plant variety protection, which precisely tries to do that, to balance the rights of farmers to save seeds, to reuse seeds, to exchange seeds, to benefit from their innovations over the last several millennia, as well as the rights of breeders in the public and private sectors to benefit from their innovations. But what we find is, at the national level, this very creative effort to balance all these rights may in fact lead to, if you've heard of the tragedy of the commons, the enclosure of the commons, free riding, not a tragedy of the commons, but a tragedy of the anti-commons. You have a proliferation of rights over seeds, therefore there's less exchange of seeds. There's less activity to maintain seeds in the public domain, and so you're getting really continued enclosure, and obviously poor farmers have less ability to pursue claims than other institutions. So we conclude that global action remains essential to maintain farmers' access to seeds, to maintain the availability of seeds for plant breeding in the public sector, and for humanitarian response, and that the international treaty is an important beginning of creating a way to realize these global obligations. And we call, in some very specific ways, for strengthening the treaty, strengthening its multilateral system, maintaining substantial plant germplasm in the public domain and subject to public access. So again, I want to thank George and Margaret as the chair of our working group for the opportunity to share these thoughts as part of this book. And I should mention it's in a series that looks at the intersection between human rights and environmental issues. So I also thought that our chapter really did try to look at how biodiversity is intimately related to human rights and the right to food in particular. Thank you very much.